Hey everybody, Denskill here. Hope you're having a good day. In today's episode of Gear Journeys, we're going to talk about modern style guitars versus vintage style guitars. Stick around. This week was a big one for Denskill Music Labs. I picked up these two fine specimens here. This modern style guitar is a Charvel Pro Mod DK24, and this is a Gibson Les Paul Special with P90s. Needless to say, these are two very different styles of guitar. I consider this one kind of modern and this one kind of vintage, although they're both newly made. Now, what makes one modern and what makes one vintage? It can be a little bit hard to define. I think it comes down to a lot of the features. I'll go through these two guitars and I'll compare them to see kind of what in my mind makes one vintage and what makes one sort of modern. We'll get to some tone examples at the end. Of course, a lot of this is subjective and just my opinion. I've heard this phrase before said where writing or talking about tone or music is a lot like trying to dance to architecture. Starting with the headstocks, basically the tuners are locking tuners, Charvel branded locking tuners on this guy, and vintage style little button ones at the end. Both have, I think, Tusk nuts or, modern materials there. Now, as far as nut widths, they're pretty similar. This Charvel, however, has a compound radius on its neck, going from a 12 to a 16. So a little rounder to a little flatter higher up the neck, where I believe this is just a straight 10-inch radius. You got loom inlay side dots on this one and 24 frets. This has your standard Gibson scale length and I believe 22 frets or 21 maybe, whatever. The back of the Charvel has this crazy sculpted heel joint here for super high fret access, whereas the Les Paul has the traditional neck joint. Of course, the pickups and electronics are very different in these guitars. This has a pair of Seymour Duncan pickups, a full shred in the bridge, and an Alnico 2 in the neck. The 5-way switch also has a split parallel switch in that little mini toggle there. This guitar has just your standard Gibson P90s, 4 controls, and a 3-way toggle switch. You got a modern gold toe 2-point style bridge here, and just a wraparound tailpiece on the Gibson. So head to head, what really makes these guitars modern versus vintage to me are basically all the ideas that are in the construction and design and build of this guitar here, the Les Paul. Pretty much, there's nothing new here that was invented, after the 50s, right? Most of these ideas for this guitar design have remained unchanged. Sure, it's now made with, modern technology like CNC machines, and the process of building them is a lot different, but you end up with a guitar that's spec'd out pretty much for something built in the late 50s. This guitar, although built basically on a Fender design, is with the 4-bolt neck, has a lot of stuff that was invented in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? The caramelized neck is a new, the roasting thing is pretty new. These Seymour Duncan pickups are, basically a shred, full shred, and an Alnico 2, which kind of, in some form or another came, maybe late 70s, 80s maybe. These particular pickups are probably a 2000s era design. And, locking nuts, these are pretty new. I don't remember these coming up, probably in the 80s or, well, not this style anyway. I don't know when these types of locking tuners were invented, but certainly not around in the late 50s. This guitar basically is straight out of the late 50s. Of course, the electronics are newish and made in a modern facility, but this is all very traditional building construction and style. And the neck has that sort of fat 50s feel as described in the product description. But in summary, what happened was, you might remember I had a Yamaha Revstar. It wasn't getting a lot of use in terms of playing out. There was something with the feel of the guitar that I just quite wasn't vibing with. So I traded that guitar in and I got this guy. So I bonded with this guitar and I can use it for my 80s cover band. But at the same time, I miss that P90 sound. And my biggest, most popular video today is my comparison of Gibson versus Lawler pickups. And to be honest, I kind of preferred the Gibson pickups and missed that LP special that I had in that video. Hence I got this guy. And the grain on it is just fantastic. So yeah, I do like this guitar for the 80s sounds that I can get out of it. The pickups sound great. Very different beast than all of my other guitars. And I love the snap and the bite of the P90s and the playability in the neck of this guitar. It feels super solidly built. I like both modern and vintage type tones. I can't afford a real vintage guitar, nor would I want to maintain one. So this is as close as I can get to that. So I'm just going to compare the tones that you can get out of these guitars in the neck, middle, and bridge positions, because that's all that's available on this guitar. There's a few more positions available on this guitar, including split parallel. But for the sake of simplicity, I'll just be comparing the pickup positions of the neck, middle, and bridge, clean and dirty. My signal chain is guitar through my quad cortex into a Seymour Duncan Power Stage 170. So looking at a guitar like this, it clearly takes after Fender Stratocaster in many ways, but it's been really hot rodded. It's a 25.5-inch scale length with 2 humbuckers instead of 3 single coils, 2 controls instead of 3. The jack plate is on the back, and with 24 frets, it's a lot different than a Strat. A lot of the features and specs on this guitar were invented basically post-50s. Things like loom inlays, caramelized necks, So that's why I think of this guitar as a more modern type guitar. That stuff just didn't exist in the 50s. This guitar shape, again, is straight from the late 50s. Just looking at the design, I mean, P90 pickups have been around for a long time. This has a nitrocellulose finish, which is an old type of paint. There's hand-wired electronics in here with old Bumblebee style capacitors. And it just has that classic vintage look from the tuners on down. And I think from a spec perspective, it's pretty clear how this one was developed a lot later than this one. And that's not probably pretty controversial. I think the only thing that I have to add to the conversation really is that I love both. I also hesitate to use words like retro when it comes to describing the sounds and the music you can play with both of these guitars. As you heard in those examples, once I piled on some of the effects, the differences between them became less evident. However, with certain effects like chorus and things, there is a definite difference in how these guitars respond. Again, it's all really subjective and your mileage might vary. When it comes to retro, I mean, people are making new sounds and new music on instruments like this, just as much as they're doing them on instruments like these. Again, these are just tools, right? All depends on what you're using them for. You know, on one extreme, you can go extreme vintage and have a guitar made with old school tools and things like that, and old world building methods. That might get you closer to the vintage sound or vintage experience. Both of these guitars, again, are newly made, but represent two different design philosophies. These things are really just tools and do two different things extremely well. The biggest difference I noticed between them when switching guitars is the neck shape and feel. This compound radius with the unfinished neck has a completely different fitting in the palm of the hand, as opposed to this chunkier, glossy, finished neck, which also feels really good and I can still shred on it, but it feels the hand a little bit different. Tonally, you'll get all the differences you'd expect between, you know, high output, relatively high output humbucker pickups and P90s. These are surprisingly pretty hot too, and I like how they sound. There's quite a bit of tonal variation in this guitar, but really not that much. Doesn't really get close to Strati in my opinion, but the pickup tone is clear and powerful and extremely even across all frequencies. I find these P90 pickups to have a bit of a mid-range honk. They're also pretty clear sounding, but have a bit of a gnarly edge. Two different tools for different styles of music, and I happen to love all kinds of music, so these will both come in handy for me. I'd like to hear your comments on what you prefer in terms of vintage versus modern spec guitars. Do you have a preference for the more modern type of appointments like in the Charvel, or are you more of a vintage hound and like the old school feel and flavor of these types of guitars? If you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing. Check out my channel for other videos on gear and for some original music. Have a great day. Dunskill out.